Hi. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the income approaches to value. And we're going to be talking about two different approaches, the first of which is the capitalization method. So capitalization, by definition, means the conversion of income into value. Just visualize an apartment building, an office complex, a shopping center, an industrial building that's going to be leased out. The rent that those properties bring in, right, will determine the value of the property based on certain market conditions. So capitalization is the name of this approach, and it's also the process by which we convert that income, or the appraiser converts that income, into a value. Now, one of the things that has to be taken into account when appraising a property using the income approach is the economic life. How long will that property be economically viable? What's the future economic life of that property? We're not looking back. We're not looking at how much it's depreciated and so on. We're looking how long into the future will that property be economically viable. And if a building is in good condition and the rents are reasonable for the market and so on, the economic life of many structures would be estimated to be 30 years, 40 years, 50 years potentially. But the economic life is the period of time over which that building will be economically viable. And when we use the income approach, the capitalization approach now, the income that we need to utilize is the net income. Not the gross income, but the net income. So how do you calculate net income? Well, here's the formula. It's pretty straightforward. We take the gross income, that's the total amount of rents that the building is producing, and subtract from that operating expenses. And operating expenses on an income property include repairs and maintenance, property taxes, insurance, salaries if you're paying some people, contract labor like landscaping and so on. All of those are operating expenses, and subtracting them from the gross income gives us the net income, the actual in-pocket income to that property owner. So remember, with the capitalization approach, we're always using net income, not gross income. Now, what the appraiser utilizes, so we have a net income from a property. Let's stop there and look at that. We have leases. The property is producing income. Maybe those leases are 4 years, 10 years, whatever. So we have income which is relatively steady, and we also have expenses. So we can arrive at an estimate of what the net income is of the property. The question becomes, what rate of return do buyers in the marketplace want to achieve in the current market? And that rate is known as the capitalization rate. That is the rate by which we will capitalize the income, the rate by which or through which we will convert the income into value. So, rate is related to risk. Think about this. If you're a buyer in the marketplace for a commercial property and you perceive that risk is going up, will you want a higher rate of return or a lower rate of return than you might have wanted last year? The answer, I think, is pretty clear. You would want a higher rate of return. Therefore, as risk increases, capitalization rates that buyers want and capitalization rates in the marketplace increase. All right, so if you felt that risk was decreasing in the marketplace, if you felt that there was little risk in owning that type of real estate, then you would actually be willing to achieve a lower rate of return. So keep in mind, cap rates are always based on risk. If risk is increasing in a market, cap rates are going to go up. If risk decreases in the market, cap rates will go down. So risk and cap rates are related. And I invented something here called a Risk-O-Rama. Just to give you a simple idea as to what we're talking about, if you had a savings account, and by the way, I'm doing this at the beginning of 2018 here, so a savings account probably would not bring 2%. It might bring maybe 0.5% or so, but everything here in this example is relative. A savings account is generally speaking considered to be very, very risk-free, so a low rate of return would be achieved in a savings account. If we're talking about CDs, and again today, right now, maybe a CD could bring 2% in reality, but I've got 4 here as a relative example, you'd perceive that as maybe a slightly higher risk. And stocks and bonds would even be considered to be a higher risk, and then venture capital, even greater risk, so venture capitalists would demand a much higher rate of return. So again, just trying to demonstrate that cap rates are related to risk. So let's talk about cap rates in relation to what we know as the ERV formula, utilizing the memory circle. Remember the memory circle? Well, here's another use for it. All right, and remember, in talking about the memory circle, the small dollars always go on top. So which of the two dollar amounts that we have here is the small dollars? Is the value the small dollars, or is the income the small dollars? Right, the income is the small dollars, so the income always goes on top. All right, and that tells you that the income is then equal to the value times the rate. Or, as the screen indicates, if you're looking for the value, which is of course what the appraiser is looking for, then you cover up the value, and that tells you to divide the income by the rate. So our formula for estimating the value using the capitalization method, the ERV formula, income, rate, and value, is value is equal to the income, remember net income, divided by the rate, and that rate is defined as the capitalization rate. So again, just to emphasize, it's net income and it's the cap rate. So here's an example in your course material. A property produces a net income of $24,000 annually. The market indicates that investors can expect a 12% rate of return. What's the value of the property? Well, this example is pretty straightforward. We're given an income, and by the way, we're always looking at annual income, and we're given a cap rate, 12%, and we're asked to find the value of the property. So we can set our memory circle up in a pretty straightforward fashion here. The income is $24,000. The rate is 12%. How do we find the value? We divide the income by the rate, and our value then is $200,000. So that's a very simple, straightforward example of estimating the value of a property using a cap rate. Now you might ask the question, where does the appraiser arrive at or get the cap rate? Well, in actual fact, he doesn't or she doesn't make it up, just pull it out of the air. They will look at other comparable sales of similar properties and see what they sold for, what their value was, what their price was, and knowing what their income was, they can arrive at the rate that each of those buyers achieved in purchasing that property. With that information, they can apply that rate to the subject property example like we have here. Now, as a second example in your course material, a little bit different. Here's the example. A property valued at $1.5 million has a gross income of $250,000 and operating expenses of 40% of the gross income. If the cap rate increases by 1%, what will the new value be? Okay, so we have a number of things going on here. We're given the value, and we're given the gross income, not the net, but the gross income, but we're also told what the operating expenses are. And then we're told that the cap rate in the market increases by 1%, and asked to find the new value based on this increase in the cap rate. So let's first go ahead and find the net income, since we have the value, the original value, or the current value, let's call it, the $1.5 million, and we have the gross income. Let's find the net income. So to do that, we take the gross income, $250,000, and we then can multiply that by 60%. Remember, the expenses are 40%, so what's left after subtracting 40% from 100%? Well, 60%. So 60% of the $250 will directly give us what the net operating income is, and that's $150,000. Now you could have also taken 40% of the $250,000, which would be $100,000, and you then could subtract that from the $250 to arrive at the $150,000 net income. Now, the step 2 would be to find the cap rate before the change. Now remember, we're told that the value is $1,500,000, and to find the rate then, we divide the income, the net income, $150,000, by that value of $1,500,000, and that gives us a cap rate of 10%. So we know based on the existing situation, the cap rate is 10%. Now, the problem says the cap rate increases by 1%. So our new cap rate is going to be, right, 11%. Our income is still the same, by the way, because of the fact that these commercial properties and income properties, their income is based on the lease, and that's the information we have. So we know the net income is $150,000. We know the cap rate, because it's changing, it's increasing, has gone up to 11%, it's increased 1%. So our value now is based on that new cap rate, $150,000 divided by 11%, that gives us a new value of $1,363,636. So remember what I said before, that cap rate is based on risk. So here apparently the marketplace has indicated that risk is higher, so buyers are demanding higher rates of return. If buyers want higher rates of return, are they going to pay more or less for a property with the same income? They're going to pay less. So keep this in mind. As cap rates increase, what happens to values? Values decrease. As cap rates decrease, what happens to value? Value increases. So what your math teacher might have told you sometime in high school is that these two things, cap rate and value, are inversely proportional to one another. Cap rates go up, values go down. Cap rates go down, values go up. So that's the basics on the capitalization approach. Keep in mind the ERV formula, the memory circle, when you're dealing with capitalization rate problems. Now, the second income approach is called the gross rent multiplier. Gross meaning gross income. Rent is the gross income. Now, to estimate a property's value using a gross rent multiplier, we use this formula. Value is equal to the gross income times, multiplied by, the gross rent multiplier. And by the way, gross rent multipliers are not used on large income properties. Where they're commonly used is on duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, smaller residential income properties. Why? Because with larger income properties, we typically use the capitalization rate. But because there's no real economies of scale on these smaller residential income properties, the GRM method is more commonly used, gross income as opposed to net income. Now the question becomes here, we know what the gross income is that fourplex is producing, but how do we arrive at, how does the appraiser arrive at that gross rent multiplier? Well, to do that, to achieve or determine what gross rent multiplier to use, the appraiser will use comparable sales. In other words, they will look at the sales price of similar properties, similar duplexes, fourplexes in the area, and they will divide that sales price, which is a matter of public record, by the rent that those properties were producing. And that gives them a GRM on 2 or 3 or 4 comparable properties. And then they can take that GRM that they've arrived at looking at those comps and apply it to the subject property. So, all right, here's an example. A comparable duplex sold for $96,000 and rented for $800 a month. That's the comp. That's the one that's sold. We're going to use that to arrive at the GRM that we're going to use. If the subject property rents for $775, what's its value? Well, just looking at that problem, would you think since the rent on this subject property is less than the comparable property, is its value going to be more or less than $96,000? You got it. It's going to be a little bit less. So let's do the math and find the GRM using that comparable property. The GRM of the comp is determined by taking the sales price of that property and divided by its gross income, by its rent. So we were given the information, $96,000 is the sales price, and it rented for $800 a month. That property then sold for 120 times its monthly rent. 120, it's a pure number, it's not a percentage. It's just a multiplier now. So we now can take that information and we can apply it to the subject property. So the value of the subject would be determined by taking the gross income of the subject, multiplying that by the GRM that we established using the comparable property. So we now take the 775, that's the income of the subject property, times the 120 multiplier, and that gives us our value using the GRM method of $93,000. And yes, it is less than the value of that comparable property as we predicted. So remember, the GRM method is used typically on smaller residential income properties, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. And we arrive at a GRM by using information from a comparable property or properties, and we then apply that GRM to the subject property. So now we've talked over 2 lessons now about the different appraisal approaches, about the market data approach, also called comparison, about the cost approach, and now about the income approaches, either capitalization if it's a larger property or gross rent multiplier if it's a smaller property. How does the appraiser bring all this information together? Well, the process of bringing all this data together to arrive at a final estimate of value is called reconciliation. So if the appraiser has data to arrive at a value using the market data approach, and has information and data from the cost approach and can arrive at a value using the cost approach, and let's say they also have data on the income approach, which one would they rely on most heavily? Well, if it's a single-family residence, a home, they're probably going to rely much more heavily on the market data approach. If it's an income property, maybe a fourplex, they're going to rely much more heavily on the income approach. And if it's a rather unique property, they may rely much more heavily on the cost approach. So this process of reconciliation is the process of bringing the data together to arrive at a final estimate of value. Let's just take a minute here and talk about appraisers and their licensing process and how they earn their money. Well, first of all, there are actually 3 categories of appraisers. Appraisers are either licensed residential appraisers, a licensed appraiser, and he or she is able to perform what are called non-complex residential transactions. The second type of license is actually called a certification, a certified residential appraiser. And a certified residential appraiser can do residential properties of any type, more complex residential appraisals. And the third type of appraiser is a certified general appraiser. And a certified general appraiser is licensed or is legally able to perform appraisals on any and all types of properties. Appraisal fees are typically based on the scope of the employment. In residential, a standard residential appraisal might cost $300, $400, $500, depending upon the scope and the time involved in that appraisal. Whereas appraisals on more complex transactions and on commercial properties can be in the many thousands of dollars. So, and different appraisers will charge different amounts. So if you or your client is ever interested in getting an appraisal done on the property, you should not only ask about the appraiser's credentials, but also ask what their fees would be. Now, real estate agents cannot perform in appraisals. Real estate agents are, however, able to perform evaluations, and they are able to charge for them, but they may not call it an appraisal. What's been common in recent years are what are called broker price opinions, BPOs, and the appraisal law does allow a licensed real estate agent to actually prepare an evaluation such as a broker price opinion or a comparative market analysis or some other analysis relative to the value of the property. And they may charge for that. However, beware, the real estate licensee who is not a licensed or certified appraiser cannot refer to that evaluation as an appraisal. So that concludes our discussion on the income approaches to appraisal.